Hello, Johan. How are you doing? It's an honor to have you here with us, and I been a great fan of yours, and so do the other people here in the Popper Institute. So I would like to introduce you, give a really short introduction because you have a so vast field of ideas and applications of the classic liberal thought. But I would like to introduce you as a historian, philosopher, filmmaker, and senior fellow of the Cato Institute. Uh, we have enjoyed your books here in Argentina and in Latin America because they are packed with ideas. They have the virtue of being short, but also thought provoking. So I think this virtue of yours as a writer has really give a great impulse to the classic liberal thought in the region, as other great classic liberal champions have done, just like Milton Friedman or other contemporaries. To start our interview, I would like to ask you about what metrics can we use to see if humanity is progressing or making progress, and I would like to know your thoughts about that.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me on the show and that very nice introduction as well. That's a very good starting point, because if you are going to discuss whether we are making progress or whether we're in decline, we have to understand what we're talking about. We need some kind of metric. It's not enough with our feeling, our gut instinct, because it differs between people. So what I use is I'm trying to find the measures that show whether we can solve more problems today than we did yesterday. Are we able to expand opportunities and well-being for people? Well, in that case, we can look at indicators like wealth, poverty, health, life expectancy, child mortality, chronic undernourishment. And then what we find is that if we're looking for a golden era in human history, this is actually it. We've seen the fastest reduction of extreme poverty that the world has ever seen. Since 1990, we've reduced extreme poverty by around 100,000 people every day. We have reduced child mortality by around half, which means that 7 million children survived this year who would have died back in 1990. And we've also managed to reduce things like illiteracy, chronic undernourishment faster than ever before. So we should be a little bit grateful about the times we're living in.
I think so, and I think nowadays we are taking all of those achievements for granted, and I'm seeing, particularly here in Latin America and in Argentina, our new rise of a populist consensus saying, well, I do acknowledge all that you are saying about progress and all the achievements political democracy and capitalism has achieved for humanity, but I think that the wealth distribution that capitalism has instated is immoral. And then they start a moral case against capitalism and a moral argument in favor of wealth redistribution, trying a somewhat ridiculous thought experiment, like saying, well, we can redistribute our way to prosperity. And I would like to know if in your opinion, is it possible to redistribute our way into prosperity?
I don't think it is, because redistribution is only about finding a new pattern for the resources, the wealth that we have. And you know what? We don't have wealth. It's not like we have a huge vault with lots of wealth and we can just go get it. Wealth and resources, it's something that we're creating every day. We are creating it in the farms, in the factories, in the laboratories, on the computers. It's something that has to be created through incredibly hard work and ingenuity by people, by businesses and groups of people. And that means that, yes, of course, you can short term take what we have today and find a more equal distribution of it. But what does that grant us? It only grants us the things that had already been created, and it says nothing about the future. Now, had we done that back in 100 years ago, people would have said the solution to the world's problem is equal distribution. Well, then we would all have been living on the average level of a sub-Saharan African country.
Yeah, the outcome would have been sensibly different, I think.
Yes. And so what we need is to create more wealth constantly, and that takes economic freedom.
Sure. I agree with you 100% in this point. And going through your last book, which I think is marvelous, and I started to read it with a group of friends which are more inclined towards socialist ideas, and we're having huge battles and interchanging opinions. I was thinking and considering why do you think that the U.S. is such a successful institutional experiment, and why do you consider it has been such a great experience protecting civil liberties and giving capitalism a great institutional structure to flourish?
Yes, partly because they were lucky. I think the great thing about the United States is that it's unlike so many other countries, it's built on ideas. And so many other places are just built on conquest, on heritage and tradition. This is a place that was started anew, and they were lucky because they happened to stumble onto the right ideas. I mean, North Korea is also built on ideas, but very bad ones.
But the wrong ideas.
Quite right. So the United States was created when the tide of Enlightenment ideas and classical liberal ideas were at its peak. So therefore, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution is infused with ideas about individual liberty and restraining the government, restraining people from using power and force against others. And that both, it meant that you started to control government in a way that it wasn't controlled back in Sweden and other European countries and other places around the world. But it also meant that it was an internal inspiration to go further with these ideas and take them seriously. They still had slavery, the worst crime against humanity that the world has ever seen, slavery. But those ideas about how man is created equal and that no one should own another human being were so powerful that they could be used by all the opponents to dismantle the oppression that was still there.
And it's also phrased in such a powerful way, don't you think? It says that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is that, in my way of thinking, you don't need much else. I think that explains why the U.S. has been such a successful institutional experiment. And I wanted to know your opinion about how the classic liberal revolution in the U.S. has inspired the classic liberal revolution in Sweden, and how the founding documents of the U.S., like the independence, the declarations of independence and the U.S. Constitution, have inspired the classic revolution in Sweden. And I would like to know a little bit of the history and your thoughts about it.
Yes, it was certainly an inspiration, and exactly those words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's, as you say, that's basically what you need. And as Benjamin Franklin pointed out, you're not entitled to happiness, but the pursuit of happiness. You have to go get it yourself, which is an incredibly powerful incentive to create a better world for yourself and for the rest of society. Well, back in the mid-19th century, when Sweden was one of the poorest countries in Europe and my ancestors were starving in northern Sweden, there was this inspiration coming from the United States, because there people could see that this is a place that's actually built on reason and freedom alone, without feudalism, without this government oppression. And it seems not just possible, but they're all actually making faster progress than we are doing. And Lars Johan Hierta, who was arguably the greatest classical liberal statesman, a newspaper publisher, and a member of parliament in Sweden, at his office, he always had Trumbull's famous painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, because always when he was struggling with new ideas, what should we do about religious freedom or freedom for business, free trade, and so on, he looked up on that painting and thinking, look,
it's all there. It's
possible. Yes, exactly. That summarizes it. And it was an inspiration for those who changed Sweden for over a 20-year period and gave us a very rapid growth rate, abolished the old authoritarian system, and abolished poverty.
And in your book, you make a point in favor of open societies. Do you think Sweden embraced this idea in this 20-year period you are talking about here? And do you think it was openness and the profound? Do you think it was openness which helped Sweden to foster capitalism and gave the country the possibility to flourish and leave that past of poverty behind?
Yes, I think that's the case. An openness for surprises, new technologies, new insights, and new business models that could make us better off. And that means openness back home, so that more groups and minorities and even women were suddenly allowed to start to come up with their own ideas and solutions to problems, but also openness internationally, so that we were open to new ideas and technologies from other places, through trade, investment, and migration. So Sweden, we didn't know how to make our railways, but we could borrow those ideas from Britain. We didn't know how to produce steel in a good way, but we imported it on license from the entrepreneurs who could abroad. And through those ideas and technologies, we made our own businesses functioning much, much better. And then we could also start to export the result. Because remember, it's a small country with a small domestic market. It's impossible to build very large companies with an economy of scale so that you reduce the price of every item that you produce. But since Swedish companies suddenly got access to larger markets because our involvement in trade deals and abolishing our tariffs against other countries, it suddenly meant that we could build these very successful multinational companies based in Sweden, giving us lots of revenue and lots of innovation.
Yeah. I think Sweden is a great successful experience of openness, and I think why do you think here in Latin America people are so fearful of openness, and why do you think we have such a Hobbesian way of looking to the strangers or foreigners, and how do you think we can change this point of view to embrace a more cooperative point of view in order to develop our economies and our civil liberties?
That's a very good question, and I think perhaps you're more of an expert than I am when it comes to this. I'd be interested in your interpretation. But what I would say is that it's not strange. On the contrary, it's quite common. What actually needs more explaining is why are some places open? Because it's often associated with fear about others, other groups, other countries, the fear that another tribe will dominate us. Because we so often think that the economy is a zero-sum game. And if someone benefits, we think that they are ripping us off. Probably because it used to be that way historically in most places, in most forms of economies, and throughout, our Stone Age past, but more recently with feudalism, with slavery, with socialism. It's always about someone gaining power and taking resources from others. So it's not strange that we've developed this instinct of being a bit fearful and afraid of the other groups and what they are up to. The key, though, to understand is that free markets is the first form of economic organization that means that you can only become rich by enriching others. It's the first system that says that no deal will ever take place unless both parties think that they benefit from it. And so it's fantastic. It's wonderful. It's brand new, and it is abolishing poverty and so many problems around the world. But unfortunately, our instincts and our fears are ancient. They developed before we had this kind of plus-sum game.
And why do you think capitalism is seen as a system that is imposed top-down for the rich plutocrats to enslave the poor workers, and not as a set of rules to foster prosperity? Because I mean, capitalism is not an oppressive order. I mean, it's, in my point of view, it's exactly the opposite. And I would like to know your point of view on the matter.
I absolutely agree. And really, free market capitalism is not a system at all. It's not something that we create and build top down from some sort of blueprint. Capitalism is what we have if we don't coerce people, force people to act in a particular way in the economic sphere. If we allow people to choose for themselves where to go, what to do, whom to associate with, what to produce, which price to negotiate, and so on. So it's really the opposite of any kind of top-down system. But I think, unfortunately, historically, the word capitalism has often been abused, both by opponents of capitalism and by many businesses and governments as well, who have called it capitalism when it was really their crony form of capitalism, not a free market version, but rather a tiny elite taking power over government and then implementing the kind of rules, subsidies, and protectionism to protect particular monopolies, and then banning all the potential competition that would have forced them to be innovative and produce better for other people. So I think there's been lots of abuse historically. So it's not strange that many people confuse free markets with that form of really crony statism. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Do you think that with this COVID pandemic, there's a possibility that this openness we are seeing nowadays and this golden age of human progress might backlash into some sort of more closed society with populist leaderships and not a globalized view of the world, but a more regional view of the world?
Yes, I'm of two minds on this issue in a way, and I will explain how. Because when I wrote my latest book, Open, The Story of Human Progress, what the pattern that I saw historically was that often in times of crisis, we become more closed-minded, and the crisis could be global, it could be a depression, a disaster, an invasion, or a pandemic. Oftentimes, historically, unfortunately, in times when we have a rapid spread of a new disease, people become afraid of the rest of the world. They become afraid of foreigners, and they become afraid of being dependent on trade that's global with international supply chains, and want to keep everything more local and back home again. So unfortunately, if the historical pattern will be continued this time around, I think at least we'll see pressure for more of that, which I think, by the way, would be a disaster, because most problems, most disasters strike locally in a particular region, whether it be natural disasters or diseases. So if you have all of your production, for example, locally, it means that if a disaster strikes locally, all your production is destroyed as well. Being dependent on others for trade and production is actually a way to be more resilient and have more alternatives, more variety when and if a disaster strikes. But it could go the wrong way. The reason why I'm of two minds on this issue is that I also think that there will be pressure for more openness. I think we'll see a more fierce debate between open and closed after this, because in a way, what we've just seen is a global real-life test of non-globalization, of in an intermission in global capitalism. We just shut it down for 6 months, and the result is not great. We've seen a global depression, mass unemployment. We've seen an increase in extreme poverty by around 100 million people. So it's really not a nice advertisement for abolishing capitalism and globalization. So I think there will also be pressure from lots of people to say, no, let's go back to more of openness, because now suddenly we realize the kinds of goods and services, technologies and jobs that it created.
Yeah, I agree with you on that point, and I think, and I wanted to know your opinion about this. Don't you think nowadays the newer generations take all the benefits from capitalism, free trade, and liberal democracy for granted?
Absolutely. I think that's the major problem that we're facing, that there's an old saying, he that has satisfied his thirst turns his back to the well. I mean, if you already have this, a fairly decent lifestyle, if you have the goods and services you need, you're literate, you've got access to medical care and so on, then you stop thinking about all the hard work, all the innovation, all the global supply chains that it took to get it to you over there. And that's dangerous, because then you start to undermine it. Then when you forget what brought it here, you just don't care about it. And then you start to experiment with other ideas on, well, let's make it even better. Let's just sort of redistribute everything or shut down international trade and so on. So that's why I'm constantly reminding people of, look, there is progress, but it's not automatic. Someone's got to do it.
We have to make a great effort in order to conquer that progress. I think that would be a great and powerful message to the newer and younger generations. And I wanted to know, what do you think about the rise of China, and if it has been a little bit of openness in the way China is approaching the global trade, but it also has a particular ingredient, because it combines an open or kind of open economy, but it still sustains an authoritarian regime. What do you think the implications for the rise of an absolute power will be to the global openness?
Yeah, no, it's very mixed. And I think that its influence right now on the world scene is quite bad, and not just in its way of trying to undermine liberal democracies in other places, but just setting the example of, this is our authoritarian way of creating wealth, and it seems to be working. And some places get really inspired by that. Authoritarians are inspired by that. What I think that people don't really understand, and this includes the Chinese Communist Party, is that what created the modern Chinese success was the open bits of this mixed system. It was really the farmers who secretly started to privatize their own land and opened up for trade. I mean, we have the documents. They did it privately because they were fed up with starving and not being able to put food on the table of their kids. And they wrote it by candlelight agreements that, look, let's privatize it. You've got your plot of land, I've got my plot of land. We can all experiment with different methods and we get to keep the results. And if the Communist Party finds out, we will bring up the kids of the parents who are forced into labor camps because of this, because it was so taboo with any kind of openness like that. But it was successful, and so were the village markets that were created and the local businesses that were created, often in the informal market, that the Chinese Communist Party basically said, and Deng Xiaoping said, that, look, we really don't like this form of grassroots capitalism, but it's actually better than starving. So afterwards, they gave their stamp of approval and said that, yeah, okay, you can do that in other places as well. And then we saw this rapid transformation of Chinese society. So it was the open bit and the individual initiatives from the bottom up that really succeeded. Then when you succeed like that and you give more people freedom to start large-scale businesses and trade internationally, you become wealthy, and then obviously you can carry around lots of old waste, old state-owned enterprises as well in the Rust Belt, and that's what they've got. It's not that that's what created the wealth. That's, on the contrary, something that destroys resources in China right now. But I think, unfortunately, the Communist Party believe their own propaganda and think that we can sort of command and control the economy. That's not how it works. And if they believe it, they will fail long term, I think, because you can imitate others and just sort of take people from farms and put them into factories and have rapid growth rates and imitate the goods and services that are created in other places. But what do you do then? When you've exhausted that growth, it has to come from new ideas and from new technologies. And if you're only open to what you already know that you want, and the Politburo stops everything else, well, in that case, they will block the sources that could create massive opportunities for China in the future. So in a way, I'm optimistic. If China is to be a long-term success, economically and sociology-wise, then they have to become more open. They have to give their people more freedom.
And that openness, I think, will make the current authoritarian structure crumble a little bit, and we might see it in a few decades. Maybe, I hope, the slow decay of the now Chinese Communist Party in control. And
I think so too, and that's why they're so afraid of it. They have this dilemma because they know that they have to open up if they want more ideas and strange new technologies. But if they do, they might lose power. So what do you do?
And it all started with this tiny shed of light of privatizing small portions of land. It's almost poetic.
It is.
Johan, I really enjoy our interview so far, and I wanted to ask you about what authors do you consider to be the most influential in the way you see the world? I can imagine a few, but I would like to hear from you which are the most the authors you consider most thought-provoking or that have inspired you to become what you are now.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I should say that modern innovative thinkers who are dealing with the problems of today have been the greatest source of inspiration. But that's not true. I think that what got me onto this path of ideas originally was really studying the classical liberal thinkers, the pioneers, like particularly, if I have to mention two, John Locke and Adam Smith, because they were both in their own way masters of explaining how development and change comes organically from the bottom up in new, unexpected ways. And I think it's the greatest, most profound insight there is Adam Smith's insight that it's not from the butcher's and the baker's self-interest that we expect meat and bread, because that's not an economic principle. It's really a way of looking at the world and at mankind, and of saying that we are not each other's enemies, something that we had always previously thought and that most religions and ideologies are based upon. If we give people freedom, they will be incredibly destructive. Adam Smith showed that that's not the case. If we have a system of rules that defines what's mine and what's yours, and that no transaction can ever happen unless both parties agree to it, well, then the benefit of somebody else, if they are growing in knowledge and in technological skills and in production, that's a benefit to me. It's good. It's good if my neighbor and the neighboring country becomes wealthier, because that creates a larger pool of ideas, resources that I can benefit from as well through voluntary exchange. And that changes your whole mentality on how you look at other people. Do you always have to keep them down because otherwise they might become a threat to you? Or should you encourage everybody else to prosper as well?
And that's, I think, the most powerful idea behind capitalism is the only system when you can rise out of poverty by rising others. And that's why what I think we should communicate to the great audience, to the great public. And I think you do a great job transmitting those powerful ideas into really short but condensed and thoughtful writings, like your last book, Open, but also in your book, Progress. And how do you think those two books connect with each other? Because you said Open is both a prequel and a sequel to Progress, and yes. I would like to connect the two books connect the two books, looking at them as a whole.
Yeah, I think you could look at it this way. Progress is the original Star Wars trilogy. It's
that's a great example for me, because I really Star Wars nerd. So
it's very modest. So that's really sort of telling the story right now. Where are we now? But when that is done, you also have to tell the story about what happened before and what happened afterwards. So in that case, Open is the Star Wars prequel trilogy and the sequel trilogy, only better, hopefully, than especially the prequel trilogy. Because what it does is that when Progress tried to say, look, the world has made enormous progress, I wanted everybody to understand that progress, including those who don't care about ideology, just convincing them something amazing has happened in our world and documenting that entirely. Now, if you agree with that, then you can go further. And that's what the Open book does. It explains why is that? And the reason, obviously, is that those cultures who have made the fastest progress were the ones who were relatively more open than others, open societies and open markets. But also what happens afterwards? Is there a risk that, because many of those cultures failed and they had their own internal struggles between forces of openness and closed, between innovators and the old incumbents and elites who feared innovation and change because it could threaten their power. Now, is there a risk that we will end up there now as well? So that's the sequel part, talking about why progress is in peril and why we really have to fight for it.
And what I really liked about Open is that you conclude the book not with a sad ending, but a call to action, I think, and is let's not take this progress for granted, but let's fight to keep it marching forward, and let's argument our way in order to foster it and keep it rolling, so it's not affected by this backlash and this context of global pandemics, where authoritarian points of view might try to push it backwards. But what I wanted to ask you, in order to close our discussion, our interview here, is what do you think it will be a call to action for the classic liberal political parties in Latin America, because we are nowadays seeing the rise of a new left wing, we might call it left wing populism, and we are really affected by this because it means now we are seeing more closed economies, more tariff, more antitrust regulations, more labor regulations. Unions are giving extreme power regulating the labor markets. And what do you think will be a great call to action to classic liberal political leaders here in the region, considering all the factors I have already described?
Yes, that is an incredibly important question, and I think that in many ways, many Latin American countries are where Sweden was in the 1970s, because we had had a relatively good run. We had created rapid economic growth and lots of opportunities, and we had many resources that were important on the export markets. And then it was so tempting for certain voters and for some people in power to just say, look, we've got all this. Why shouldn't we just take it and hand it out to the people or to preferred groups in various places? And then we had 20 years in Sweden when we really increased the size of government, increased taxes, started to regulate the economy. Unfortunately, it was the period in Swedish history, the one period in Swedish modern history, when we lagged behind everybody else, because we really attacked the pillars of innovation and of wealth creation. And I fear that's really what this leftist populist turn in Latin America is doing as well. I understand why. It's easy, especially when you've had these worrying international climate, to look for the strong man or for the big government to protect you. And then it's so incredibly important to look again at what is it that worked in these economies and what is it that didn't work in these economies. Look at the foundations, the pillars of wealth creation, and what happens whenever you start to implement political control and trade union control over certain places. And then I think it's fairly easy to see that you suddenly destroy that innovation, that for the engine of progress that is taking place in more open areas. I think that's the call to action, to realize that all progress is dependent on surprises. It's dependent on openness for the people who don't fit into the great plans of the planners, the politicians, the trade unions, those who are outside of the system but can come up with a new idea on how to produce more, how to transport it faster, or to create something that's cheaper and therefore increases the purchasing power for others. It's also always those invisible people, in a way, who can create something that we didn't understand existed. So I think the call to action is to fight for those invisible groups who don't have any kind of pressure groups, because the future doesn't have a pressure group. It's only the old interests who have pressure groups, in a way. But if we defend those, if we can defend them and leave them this openness for freedom to experiment, then we will create a better future for everybody.
Thank you so much for this call to action. And I would like to close our interview with that beautiful piece. And I would like to thank you on behalf of the Popper Institute to share your valuable time with us. And we would like to have you here in Argentina to share another interview in the future, with your physical presence here, I hope. And thanks again, Johan, for your kind words and for sharing your thoughts through your books and through this great interview.
Thanks for inviting me.
Words of appreciation towards you. So I hope we can meet again soon. And thank you so much for all you have done for us.
Thank you. This was fun. I'd love to be there physically the next time if the world opens up again. Yeah, let's hope.
I hope. Thank you so much, Johan.
Thanks.